this is Luke.
And this is Tom.
And we are here today. We're going to run through Freeplay and how that works in Those Who Dare. So, to start with, we've got skill checks. First up, we're going to run through how an individual skill check works. That's a skill check for one character. Tom, do you want to run us through how you build dice pool for your character?
Absolutely. So, characters will always begin with their aptitudes, of which they have 4: fitness, danger, psyche, and cognitive. And what you'll do is you'll have levels ranging from 0 to 6, and that will be the initial part of your dice pool, will be to get those levels. Say you're making a fit skill, and you have 1 in fitness, you'll put 1 dice down. You'll then have individual skills, which will be associated with each of those aptitudes, and you'll put the same amount of points from those skills into the pool. So let's say I had a 2 in my agility, then together I'd have 3 dice, and that would be my dice pool.
Nice and easy. So you take your aptitude, you add your relevant skill, and that's how many d6s you get to roll. There's a few ways you can modify those individual checks though. So one of the main ways that you'll influence your checks is through gambits. Do you want to run us through how a gambit works?
Sure. So a gambit is something that players can unlock for certain actions, which allows you to, once you've rolled your check, lock in 1 or more of the dice and re-roll the remaining dice. This allows you to essentially spend some resources to increase the chances of you succeeding in a roll.
That's correct. So every gambit costs 1 stress by default, and there are certain factors that can increase the price of a gambit. Gambits are exponentially more powerful the more skilled you are, and this represents that there's a momentum to ability, and that the better you get at something, the more competent you get overall, and the better you can compensate for your own errors.
And this will lead into difficulty. So most skill checks will start at normal difficulty, which requires you to get 1/6. But as the difficulty increases, it can go all the way up to requiring 6 6s at nearly impossible difficulty. And so this is where you're going to want to build up your skills in your pool and then use gambits to really help yourself get to that level for the hardest challenges.
Correct. And you don't necessarily know how difficult it's going to be. In most cases, your GM will not tell you what the difficulty is. They might give you some kind of a descriptive indication of how hard you think it might be. You won't know how much success you'll need. Once you've taken a check though, your GM can tell you if you've met the difficulty yet, and then you could decide if you wanted to spend more resources to try and reach it. And a nice GM might give you some indication that you're really close but you're not quite there, so you can make a slightly informed decision about whether you should invest more resources in the same check. And what about if you have no skill and no aptitude?
Sure, so in that case you make what's called a shot in the dark. You will spend 1 stress and then roll 1 single dice.
So this is a real unlikely one. And keep in mind that the approach in Those Who Dare is that if something's trivial, you should never be taking a check. Checks should only be for significant moments or particularly challenging things. So you'll note that with a standard difficulty requiring a 6, it means that the odds are against people to begin with. So where things aren't particularly difficult, it can just be assumed that a player would be able to do it. It is possible for there to be some other modifiers as well. The GM can impose bonuses or penalties on dice for varying situations. For example, say the party was trying to sneak through an area while there was alarms blazing or something. The GM might just decide that, well, everyone's on high alert here, so everyone gets a penalty. But there's a variety of ways that the GM might influence the dice in those kinds of situations. They might decide, you're too distracted to do something easily.
So what happens if I want to make the same check multiple times in a row?
So generally speaking, you can't just attempt the same thing again unless something has changed. So to repeat a check, either the situation has to have changed, which could mean, now you're using a set of tools that you weren't using before, or another character is assisting in some way. So the situation needs to have changed. You could have found out some more information about what's going on. Otherwise, the cost must increase significantly. So, for example, say you tried to pick a lock and failed. Well, you can try the same check again, but the cost of that check has to increase significantly. So this might mean that you decide, okay, well, I didn't get this in a minute, so I'm going to spend 10 minutes here working on this lock to try and crack it.
But who knows if anyone's going to catch you in that extra time you've taken, so the risk is always going to increase.
Exactly, that's right. So risk is likely likely to increase, or the cost in resources to the character or party is going to increase. But that's pretty much how individual skill checks work. Then we have group skill checks, and in Those Who Dare, there's actually two kinds of group skill checks: high group checks and low group checks. And the reason for this is because there are different ways that people collaborate with each other, and we've sort of categorized those down into two ways. So in a high group check, this is where the check is led by the strongest character. So, for example, say a group of characters were trying to figure out how to synthesize a cure to a virus. Well, you might have one character who's very good with the medical skill and is capable of doing this kind of work. They could benefit from assistance from others, but only other skilled characters really. It wouldn't help to have Gork the Barbarian running around the lab smashing things with a battle axe. But if another character, say, had the chemistry skill, that could assist, or if another character had, pharmaceuticals, that could assist. So in that case, you'd take each character who has a relevant skill. The strongest character or highest total dice pool character would lead the check, and the check would gain a locked 6 for each other participating character, which is obviously very powerful.
That is very strong, and it's important to note that the way our skill system works is it's quite flexible. If you can argue to the GM that your skill or item or whatever is applicable, then it can become part of the check, whether that be this type of group check or other checks.
Exactly. Now, there are a couple of things with group checks though, and with high group checks, you're working together, which gives you a much better chance at success, but it also means that failures can be a bit more impactful. So for every 1 still showing on any dice, every character who participated will gain a stress, which is quite a serious penalty. So that's something to be considered. And in addition, you might also have noticed that your chances of getting 6s are probably a lot higher in a high group check, but you can't bank 6s, or you can't bank successes from a high group check.
It'd be too easy to game if you could do that.
Exactly. So next up, we'll just run through low group checks.
Sure. So with a low group check, all relevant characters will participate. However, the worst character leads the check. So imagine you have a group of people attempting to sneak by guards. The only person that really matters is the one who's worst at stealth, because they're most likely to be the one who fails that. So they will be the one who will lead the check, and they'll make a roll. And if they fail, everyone else is assumed to have failed. So characters with higher skills, though, can remove the lowest characters by paying 1 stress. So if we had an expert in stealth, they can give that character a hand. And
just also with low group checks, you still can't bank 6s. It's less likely that it would come up, but you could have, if it's a 2-person low group check, the stronger player still isn't able to bank their 6s. And you can't bank 6s with group checks because banked 6s represent that momentum of victory, but when it's a shared victory, there's no one character who can really claim, even though in these cases they're led by a single character, the actual specifics of how it works in the game is that they would all share that action. So alrighty, there's one other type of check, which is opposed checks. And now opposed checks are not always used, so we're not going to run through all of campaign setup in this today, but this will touch on an important aspect of campaign setup, which is PvP. So in Those Who Dare, we've made a few flexible rules which the group or GM can decide on at the start of the game. You can discuss it together and decide what kind of game you like, and one of those is the level of collaboration between the party. So a typical game is likely to be a friendly game where there's no one directly working against anybody else. In a friendly game, you wouldn't use opposed checks because you'd instead just talk through as players, who wants to do what and make a decision at the player level. But you can also play with cooperative, where players, they can't directly attack each other, but they can mess with each other. So you might have situations arise where 2 players want to do the same thing at the same time, or one player simply just wants to stop another player from doing something. Then you'd have an opposed check. So you both just roll an individual skill check at the same time. Whoever has the most 6s would win. In a tie, it depends on whoever has the next highest number on a dice. So if one player had a 5 and another player only had a 3, then the player with the 5 would win. If the dice are still tied, then everyone's action is going to fail. And because this is essentially 2 characters taking an individual skill check, 6s can be banked with opposed checks. Just to mention it though as well, the final type of campaign setting for PvP is where you have full PvP allowed. So this is something that would probably only be used for maybe short campaigns or one-shots where, you know, player disagreement is a highlight of the campaign. You know, maybe you're playing through a band of gladiators, only one person can become the final champion of the arena at the end of the campaign, so eventually you might all turn on each other. You know, up to the GM and the players, but not used that much.
You'll see in the book we've rated each of the PvPs by difficulty for the GM and the players to run, and we definitely do advise that anything with more than a friendly amount of competition can really cause, you know, game external problems, player fighting and that kind of thing. So it should only be taken if you know what you're doing.
Yep, the most important thing is to play the kind of game that you're all going to be happy with. So in this and in our other videos, we've talked about banked successes quite a little bit, but we'll just cover over exactly what that means. So as mentioned, after you've rolled any check, if you have excess 6s, you can store these for later use. Excess 6s can't exceed your current stress level though. So if, say, you've got 2 stress currently and you roll a fantastic roll and get 5 6s in a single check, you're only going to be able to bank 2 of those. And the banked successes are unique to the aptitude they were rolled with, so you may have to make choices about, you know, well, do I want to keep a couple of danger successes in case we get into combat? Do I want a couple of fitness successes in case I need to stealth through this? You know, I'm not good at stealth, so it'd be really handy to have that banked fitness success so I can just pass a check later. There's a lot of strategy behind what 6s to store, and this is the main reason you want to keep some stress, but if your stress decreases or when you take a downtime, you will lose your banked successes. Okay, the last couple of things about free play, unlike in the action phase, which we described a week or so ago, in free play, instead of actions, you have activities. And so these are parallel to actions. You get them from some perks, and there may be a couple of other ways to get them. And they're basically unique things that some characters can do that your average person couldn't do. I believe you've got an example of one of these, Tom?
Absolutely. So I've got a character who has the computer hacking specialization, and this allows them to send encoded messages or to access systems that regular characters, even those who know how to use a computer, would not have access to. And this would be a free play activity, so it's something that's going to take a few minutes to longer to do. It's not something you can do during action phase, during the heat of combat, but something given time you can sit down and in this case they could access a database or they could send off a coded message.
And the last thing to cover off in free play is experience. So we have had people ask us about whether there's leveling up in Those Who Dare. Now, there isn't specifically leveling up. We don't like that
very gamified
the
way
very
that,
gamified
levels work in some games.
Yeah, exactly. So instead what happens is every time you use any of your skills, you mark off that that's been used. It only needs to be marked off the one time between downtimes, and when you take a downtime, you'll have the opportunity to solidify some of these experiences into lessons, which will help you develop these skills. We'll go through that in full in downtime shortly, but during free play and action phase, the important thing is that whenever you use a skill, there's a small indicator next to each of your skills on your character sheets, which you can just mark off that this skill has been used, which means that there's something you could learn there from your activities.
Great, thanks for that, Luke. I hope you've all enjoyed our video on free play and skills. Keep an eye out for our next video where we'll put this all into practice with an example of free play and downtime. Until then, thank you so much and take it easy.